All right, so it is 1:30, so we'll get going. I see the numbers climbing, so I'm sure folks will continue to join over the next couple minutes. Welcome, everyone, and we're so excited to have you join us today for our session on evidence-based carbohydrate restriction. We have some pretty amazing guest speakers, so we're going to jump right into it. And yeah, I want to begin, of course, by acknowledging the respective land on which I'm fortunate enough to live, work, and play on every day. I'm located in the Fraser Valley area of British Columbia, and it's a beautiful day here. So I want to really express my gratitude and acknowledge that I work within the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish, Stalo, and Kwantlen nations. And with that, my name is Raman Bowerbank. I work as a leader of health system improvement with the BC Patient Safety and Quality Council. More than that, I am a passionate change maker, a daughter, sister, wife, and a mother, and also a lifelong learner. And that is why I'm so excited to be here today, listening to our guest speakers and learning from them. I am hosting today's session alongside my wonderful colleague, Shauna Nickel, who will be more of the technical host. So feel free to either message myself or Shauna or email us at diabetes@bcpsqc.ca for any issues or questions you may have. So I feel like at this point of 2020, we're all pretty much experts at all these meeting platforms, but just in case, just a quick heads up that you are muted and your video is off when you enter the webinar. If we could keep it that way, just up until the question and answer period that will follow Eliana and Michelle's presentation, that would be fantastic. And with that, I am super excited to introduce you guys to Eliana and Michelle. So Eliana on the left here, Eliana Witchell is a registered dietitian and the founder and chief eating officer of Eat Different RD, her virtual practice, private practice in Ontario. She partners with medical teams to help their patients improve health. Where appropriate, she safely prescribes carbohydrate-reduced dietary approaches with her patients. She has partnered with a number of organizations to help lead the development of evidence-based resources and webinars to safely offer food-first approaches designed to reverse or put chronic disease into remission. And Michelle on the right, Michelle Shepard is a registered dietitian with a Bachelor of Science in Food, Nutrition, and Health. She teaches sports nutrition at Langara College, and she has spent almost a decade with BC Cancer before she opened up West Coast Nutrition, which is a full-service nutritional program located in Langley, BC, dedicated to providing clients with proven modern advice and tools to take control of their health. More than that, I've worked with them in the last couple of days quite closely, and they are just two very humble, passionate, and super smart women that I'm really, really honored to have here with us today. So over to you, Michelle and Eliana.
Thank you so much. Let me just make sure. Okay, and I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right. Thank you so much for having us. We're so excited to be here. Michelle and I are very excited. A huge thank you first of all, for you guys taking time out of your busy schedules. Life's been chaos this year for everybody. And so we do appreciate the time to be able to spend with you. A huge thank you as well to Raman and Shauna and the BC Patient Safety and Quality Council, the IHSTS. Huge thanks for inviting us. We're so honored to be here. With that, let's get started because it's a jam-packed session. We want to make sure that we manage our time here. So we do not have any financial relationships to disclose. Let's see what's happening. There we go. Quick learning outcomes. The first one is we want to touch base on remission of diabetes and just share some of the evidence that's out there. This is new to me. I didn't even know this was a concept. I didn't know you could reverse diabetes. And so just to give everybody a bit of background before we dive into what does an evidence-based carbohydrate restricted diet look like, and there are many things it could look like. It's not just a ketogenic diet. Now today is 40 minutes for us in this hour webinar. We've done a 2-hour session with the IPTN. So definitely check out that webinar. There's tons of information there, especially stuff that we can't cover today. If you have questions, reach out to us, reach out to Raman or Shauna, and we'll get you hooked up with that webinar. A couple of quick declarations. Both Michelle and I have worked with the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition. We both have our private practices. I've just recently started a pasture-raised farm. And in terms of dietary declarations, we both choose to be omnivore. We also both eat within ketogenic to moderate carbohydrate restricted diets, all of which we're going to talk about today. If you don't know what that means, that's okay. We also choose to follow some sort of time restricted eating, generally between 12 and 16 hours per day. Because we also have our own vices, and who wouldn't love Oreos? So that's mine. Wine is Michelle's. And with that, let's kind of get going. All right, so we want to know what you know. And so along the continuum of knowledge and skill, where do you find yourself, especially specifically with carbohydrate restriction? So have you just become aware of it? You're beginning to learn about it. You can maybe discuss the potential benefits or risks. You can safely teach and monitor a patient, or you can teach other professionals and provide leadership. So I'm just going to give you another 10 seconds just so we can keep going here. All righty, I'm gonna do that. Okay, so I'm gonna share the results. So let's see, so 14% of you have just become aware of it. A good number of you have either are beginning to learn about it or can just start to discuss the risks and benefits, and very few can teach it safely and monitor and help and teach other health professionals. Our goal today is to give you more information and more resources on the website with Raman and with Shauna. There will be all of our references. So those are fantastic places to start. There's some great review articles, so check those out as well. All right, let's get this pull out. Okay, quick outline before we dive into everything. So we're going to talk real quickly about diabetes and hyperinsulinemia in Canada. I'll talk about diabetes remission, what that means, what that looks like in the literature. And the meat and potatoes of today is going to be carbohydrate restricted diets. Potatoes might not be on a ketogenic diet, and medication safety is a huge component of that. So we are going to spend time to talk about that with a few takeaways. Okay, so starting points. When we talk about carbohydrate restriction, Michelle and I are talking about a therapeutic diet specific for metabolic dysregulation. We are not talking about this for the masses. Second, this is a medication. There are medication safety risks associated with a carbohydrate restricted diet. And we're going to talk about that today. It's a huge piece. And as such, it is imperative that the interdisciplinary team work together. Dietitians must work with doctors, pharmacists, nurses, the allied health team, because we cannot modify medications. And we'll take a look at a study in a little while of how much medication change happened in 1 year. All diets are tools in the toolbox. And this one is so important. I didn't have the right tools in the toolbox. And I was so frustrated as a dietitian trying to help patients with metabolic dysregulation, and I couldn't help them get better. And so having a number of tools in the toolbox is important, because not every diet's going to work for everyone. And anyone who says that their diet's the best is wrong, because it doesn't work for everyone, and sustainability is that piece. So these are tools in the toolbox, and it is the patient's right to choose how they want to proceed with their health. The last thing I want to mention is there are loud voices with any dietary intervention, but low carb is no exception. And in the low carb community, there are some very loud voices, and they drown out those who are more moderate. And Michelle and I are coming to you as moderates, and we want to help you be able to know how to help patients do this safely. So with that, Michelle, let me just... Oh, where are you, Michelle? There you are.
Thank you, Eliana.
There you go.
Perfect. I can see the arrows and everything. Thank you so much for that introduction, Raman and Eliana. I'm really pumped to be here. And I think this section is one where I really lacked knowledge and understanding. And so being able to dive through it with you, I think is just going to really bring us all to the same starting place. There we go. So according to Statistics Canada, 63% of Canadians are overweight or obese. And that really stands out to me as a dietitian and a health professional and someone who's worked with patients over just a spectrum of their lifetime and goals of care as pretty scary, given what we know about obesity and the effect on metabolic health. I do want to be clear that I think there's a really big difference between the wide variety of bodies and healthy weights. But what we're talking about is when obesity comes with excess body fat and that induces changes in how our body functions. That might include liver and pancreatic function changes, genetic expression, inflammatory cascades. All of these things that can come from that type of obesity contribute to cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes risk. These are the big three kind of killers and costs to Canadians. And if I were to dial that in a little bit more, you'll see we've circled kind of one little guy on the right-hand side there. Diabetes rates have increased right alongside obesity rates and just a shift in our diet over the decades. It's a growing health concern to Canadians, and 1 in 3 Canadians has already been diagnosed with diabetes or pre-diabetes. And that does not include the estimated 1.5 million Canadians who do not know they even have it. So this is obviously a huge burden on our healthcare system in terms of hours spent, our labor, time with patients, and of course dollars managed to medication and interventions later stage with all of those complications that occur with diabetes. So let's talk about the path to type 2 diabetes. And so if we drill down a little bit, this is something that really just like totally grabbed me as I went down the rabbit hole and dug into the research around diabetes and insulin and just the trajectory that I really didn't know. And I don't think we've done a good job of kind of updating our practice over the last 20 years, just because everything does move so slowly. And so what I think is really important is that if you look at that line down the middle, that is diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So that's where blood sugar might be off and we say, okay, you need to change your life. But if you actually look to the left of that graph, we can see that the impaired glucose metabolism, the increase in insulin, and even the macrovascular complications actually start quite a ways before diagnosis. So when patients are arriving and we're kind of identifying them, they already have metabolic dysregulation and they may already have some significant damage. And so what's really interesting is that according to the 2013 guidelines by the European Society for Cardiology and the European Association for the Study of Diabetes, insulin is actually high in years to decades before blood glucose is overtly sort of not well regulated anymore, or shows up as a high fasting or A1C. And this explains why so many patients seem to have such a difficult time after diagnosis, managing their blood sugar or losing weight, given how late in that trajectory we're actually getting involved. So I really just think this is such an important part for me to note that really we're wanting to get involved with patients earlier on where possible, but also recognizing that when we have patients who are diabetic, we may need to use a more therapeutic diet to intervene the way we would with another condition. If Eliana, you wouldn't mind highlighting, oh, there we go. And so just a quick note on hyperinsulinemia and disease. As Eliana mentioned, we did just a monster of like a 2-hour presentation on all the details, but I did think it important to point out just how many conditions have been linked to hyperinsulinemia, a whole host of neuropsychiatric, GI, endocrine, obviously that's why we're here today with diabetes, some cancers, skeletal and circulatory diseases, and of course, most of the inflammatory linked ones. And so why is it? So what is the link to those elevated insulin levels that are going up decades before we catch patients with diabetes? Something that may be intuitive to the RDs here, but not necessarily to the public or sometimes to other health professions, depending on how involved in nutrition you are, is that almost 50% of total calories for Canadians are now from ultra-processed foods. these are foods that go through multiple processes before we eat them. They have things added and removed. They're highly manipulated. So think about the, chicken nuggets, the sweetened cereals, the ice cream, the candy, the hot dogs, all the gamut of kind of convenient processed foods. This is important because obviously we are reducing the nutritional value, the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber that help our body with repair and regulation. But the link to hyperinsulinemia here is more likely that we are increasing the carbohydrate absorption rate because these foods are so highly processed. What that means is you get that big blood sugar spike and of course the big insulin spike to go with it. So certainly for many of our patients, this kind of ultra processed diet that Canadians are eating is contributing to that kind of long run-in. So it does make sense that just about any whole foods approach is going to improve health outcomes. And we're just talking about one of them today. And so obviously what we're pointing out here is that there is a variety of whole foods approaches that can work, both based on our experience in nutrition as well as the literature. We know that the DASH diet, in some cases low fat, Mediterranean, vegetarian, vegan, all have places as options for our patients in the literature, and that therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, including a low carbohydrate or a more significant intervention like ketogenic, is going to be a good option for patients if it fits them. And just a note that these should all be kind of tools in our toolbox to help our patients. And I'll pass it off to Eliana here.
Oh, can you hear me? There we go. All right, I'm back. Okay, so let's talk about remission for a moment. What does remission mean? So complete remission of diabetes is defined as the disappearance of signs and symptoms, as well as normalized fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C without pharmacotherapy for at least 1 year. That's complete remission. Partial remission is considered pre-diabetic hyperglycemia for your fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C without pharmacotherapy for at least 1 year. And the reference is there for you. And so with that understanding of remission, let's talk about some of the studies. So here at the very bottom, this is usual care. When we think about reversal remission of diabetes, there's not much. And so it makes sense that previously we hadn't really understood diabetes to be a condition that perhaps you could actually reverse. At least I had no concept that that could even be a thing. Because of time, we're not going to go through each of these studies, but I want to highlight the top 4. So number 4 is a lifestyle intervention study where patients who are diagnosed with diabetes within that year, they had a huge intense intervention and they saw some significant reversal and remission in their study after that 1 year. Study number 3 is a low carb program. So low carb being between 100 and 130 grams of carbs, not anything crazy, but it's an online platform, a 10-week program that patients could do in the comfort of their own home. And for the patients who completed the program, 26% of them at 1 year were seeing reversal remission. Number 2 is the direct study, which is a very low energy diet. And I know even for myself, the emotions I had with a very low energy diet was like, no, I don't like that option. But again, that's the wrong approach because this is a tool in the toolbox. And so with this dietary approach, it can work for the right person. And if we look at the results that our colleagues in the UK are having, at 2 years, they're seeing 36% reversal or remission. And they're finding that the more the weight loss happens and the weight stays off, the more they're having remission. The one we're going to focus on today is the ketogenic diet, the University of Indiana, also called the Virta Health Study. A couple of things about this study. One is that it is not randomized controlled. Patients chose this dietary approach and they were medically supervised and supported. What does that mean? This should be the gold standard or held up as a gold standard. If a patient chooses a ketogenic diet and is properly and safely medically supported, this could be the results we see. So let's look into it a little bit more in more detail. So on the right-hand side, you're going to see the medications that were either reduced or eliminated. And this is where at the very beginning, I said it is absolutely vital that we all work together as a team, because I can't help reduce these medications with a patient. I need that doctor, that pharmacist, that nurse to be working together with me so that there is safety for this patient as they start a lower carbohydrate way of eating or a ketogenic diet way of eating. In this particular case, of course, is ketogenic. On the left-hand side, we see that in that first year, you've got 60% of these patients reverse their diabetes. 94% of patients reduced or eliminated insulin. When do we hear that people with diabetes are coming off of their insulin? This is rare, and it makes me excited because there's hope. Their A1C came down by 1.3%. on top of the fact that their medications were reduced. They lost 30 pounds that year on average, and the retention rate was 83%, which is really great. Now, also, we know that the first year of a study is like that honeymoon period. So what happens at year 2? Well, we know that the results are going to be worse, but it wasn't bad. 54% of these patients, instead of 60, reversed their diabetes. 17.6% of patients had achieved partial or complete remission of diabetes. I also forgot to mention that this study also, people who had diabetes for years could have been on this, could do this diet, and we're starting to see remission of diabetes. Their hemoglobin A1C went up a little bit compared to year 1, and they did gain a little bit of weight. And of course, the retention rate was a little bit lower. Now, again, this is a study. Let's talk real life. Let's talk sustainability. A diet for a patient today might not be the right diet for the patient tomorrow or the next day because of COVID, because of death, because of funerals, because of life, because of going to vacations, whatever it is. And so diet is always fluid, and we as health professionals have to understand that and be fluid with them and help them. Okay, if today you're on a ketogenic diet, no problem. This is how we're going to proceed. Tomorrow they come back and this is not working. Okay, let's go up to a lower carbohydrate restricted diet or a moderate carbohydrate restricted diet, no problem. Maybe they maintain there and then they come down. This is important that we're with them and we're fluid with them and adjust medications as necessary. That's what's going to be sustainable for the patient. All right, poll question, true or false? There are no clinical guidelines around carbohydrate restricted diets in Canada. And go. I'll just give you guys about 10 seconds, okay? All righty. Let's see here. So, okay, I'm sharing the results. Okay, so most of you said that that's true. There are no clinical guidelines around it, and some of them said false, and probably is somewhere in between. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Here, one sec. Okay, there are a ton of international guidelines on carbohydrate-restricted diets, and we've had some sort of guidelines since 2011. Who knew? I didn't even know low carbohydrate diets were a thing until at least 2013. And really, it wasn't until the last 2 or 3 years that most of the recommendations or guidelines have come out. The American Diabetes Association actually in December 2019 came out and actually made carbohydrate-restricted diets part of their standards of care, actually saying there is no single ideal dietary distribution of macronutrients for the general population. Everything has to be individualized. And that's wonderful for dietitians because that means we have so much freedom to help patients find out what their right mix is, right? So is it higher protein for you? Is it maybe a little bit higher carb, or is it higher fat, or what is it? We have that freedom. Now, these may or may not be considered clinical guidelines, so that question was maybe a bit tricky. But I'm so happy to say that Diabetes Canada did come out with their position statement on carbohydrate-reduced diets. And essentially, here's the lowdown on it. One, it's an emerging field. So there's going to be things that we think about today we just don't know, and we're going to know more in a couple of years. And with that, there are things we have to consider, and perhaps our patients this is not appropriate for, and so we have to be aware of all of that stuff. But for the right patient, it is a viable option, especially if you're trying to lose weight or bringing down your blood sugars or also reduce your medications. Now, dietitians, these guidelines are recommending that patients come and see us to do this dietary approach safely. So we need to make sure that we know how to do this so we can step up and help our patients with that. Now, of course, there's also the medication safety piece. And as a result, we have to be working with that interdisciplinary team so that we can make sure that we're doing this in a safe way and patients don't have any issues with their medications. On that note, Michelle is going to tell us about carbohydrate restricted diets. And Michelle, let me know if I have to reshare.
Oh, good. It looks
Access.
good. Thanks, Eliana. So thank you so much, Eliana. I think that was such a great review. And again, we packed a lot of information into a short time. So if you really want a deep dive on that, Eliana has a great one in our kind of full version. So what are carbohydrate restricted diets? Today is designed to be super practical. And I think this is the area where we get confused because of what I like to call internet keto, right? It's just all the fats, all the processed foods, you know, no balance, no vegetables. And so let's actually dive into both kind of in our practice and in the literature. What does carbohydrate restriction look like in terms of real food? So let's start with some definitions. Sorry, we're just clicking back and forth there. There we go. So starting with definitions, this is based on a paper by Feynman et al., which has some great information in it. But let's look at that. So a typical kind of high carbohydrate diet would be more than 45% of calories from carbs. Moderate carbohydrate, kind of 26 to 45% of calories coming from your carbs. General low carb diet is going to be kind of 10 to 25%. And a ketogenic diet, or the more sort of significant form of restriction, is going to be less than 10% of calories from carbs, or generally less than 50 grams of carbs a day. As you can see on the graph, there's kind of a range of approaches depending on what your patient needs. I do want to make a note here that some of the approaches that we already use, like Mediterranean, are actually somewhat reduced carb compared to something like the AMDR, or acceptable macronutrient distribution range, already, and we just never kind of broken them down. And just a reminder for the healthcare professionals out there, because I often get this kind of in conversation with, you know, physicians or other practitioners that I'm speaking with, is, well, if the acceptable macronutrient distribution range is, you know, 45 to 65, how can we give this to patients? Those ranges and the RDAs are designed for fully healthy patients and population health approaches. So if your patient has prediabetes or diabetes or elevated insulin, that no longer applies to them. And we should be very careful not to apply kind of healthy population guidelines to patients who actually need some intervention so that they can have a better quality of life and length of life, hopefully. And so let's look at what carbohydrate, oh, sorry, we're getting 2 clicks at a time here. I apologize. Eliana, if you don't mind clicking, there you go, thank you. So looking at what therapeutic carbohydrate restriction was in terms of nutrients in foods in the research. So this paper by Turton et al. Kind of dug through a whole bunch of carbohydrate restricted trials and said, okay, what did we feed people? What did we tell them? So in trials that we saw results as far as their diabetes remission, what did that look like? So I think what's important here is that really therapeutic carbohydrate restriction is fairly diet agnostic, as are Eliana and I. So I have vegan patients, I've got low carb patients, I've got omnivorous patients. It really depends on what they need. But in the literature, the only thing we did see is generally in trials, the protein usually came from animal sources, but you can absolutely do carbohydrate restriction or even ketogenic on a vegan or vegetarian diet. And there's a number of great RDs out there kind of doing this and supporting patients. The carbohydrates will generally come from sort of your non-starchy vegetables, your nuts and seeds, maybe the dairy if the client is including it. And depending on the level of carbohydrate restriction may also come from normal things like fruit and starchy vegetables. The fats were actually never prescribed, which I love. So patients were encouraged to eat to satiety, to add fat as needed for taste and fullness, and generally encouraged to come from more whole food sources like nuts and seeds and avocados, things like that. And the one really nice thing I thought this covered as well is these trials also accounted for fluids or water intake and electrolytes, especially sodium. And Eliana will talk about why this is so important to the success of these types of interventions later on. Let's see if we can click forward. Da-da-da. There we go. So let's look at a well-formulated ketogenic diet, partially because this is a gap we identified in a needs assessment that Eliana and the IPTN kind of ran, and also because I think there's so much misinformation out there, especially because I know we've got some patients and public on today. So let's dial in just a little bit for these couple of slides, even though a ketogenic diet is not always the goal. So I do want to be clear that any diet can be done poorly. Ketogenic is absolutely no different. And to do it right, you do need diversity in food. So if you look at the box on the left, the goal is, of course, still balanced plates and whole foods as much as possible. How ketogenic diets work is that in the presence of carbohydrates, glucose would usually be the body's primary fuel, especially at medium to high intensities. Most of us who are health professionals, we learned this way back in university, aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis, all of that stuff. When we eat carbs, we break them to sugars and they kind of get used up that way. When we're following a very low carbohydrate diet, or in this case, a ketogenic diet, there's a shortage of glucose coming from food. And so the body has to make glucose, the body has to make energy, or ATP, by switching to first gluconeogenesis, so making glucose from fats or sometimes from proteins, or switching fully to ketogenesis, which is making ketones from fatty acids. And ketones become the primary fuel source on a ketogenic diet, about 70% of energy usage in just about all of the tissues, including the brain. So the brain utilizes ketones quite well and quite happily. And they are a totally normal, natural thing that we produce, when we are fasting for surgery or overnight, any of those things. Ketone production is fairly fluid, but of course, increased significantly in the absence of lots of carbohydrates. And so as this kind of occurs and levels of ketones rise in the blood, we get what is called a state of ketosis. So let's pause and do a little poll. Patients with type 2 diabetes are at high risk for diabetic ketoacidosis on a carbohydrate-restricted diet. And this is an important one, so we're going to talk about it a lot. I'll give you just a few seconds to kind of roll through there. See if we can get a few more answers. So we got lots. Oh, it's heating up in there. All right, guys. So I'm going to share that because I think we've got just about everybody. And I'm going to share those results with you. So we've got a bit of a split. About 73% said false and about 27% said true. So let's dive into the answer, which is, of course, as all things nutrition and medicine, it depends. And I'll just click to my own slides here. So I do want to be clear here that ketosis and ketoacidosis are not the same thing. Ketosis is generally defined as blood ketones between 0.5 and 3 millimoles. And to be clear, patients may likely have significant benefits with carbohydrate restriction, the lower blood sugar, and the lower insulin, even if they're not producing significant levels of ketones. But one of the most common misconceptions I hear from particularly dietitians and the physicians that I work with and talk to is they don't want to use this diet because they are afraid of ketoacidosis. That's harmful, it's going to hurt the body, and it's a big risk. And so let's dive into that. Ketones, just like blood sugar, have a huge spectrum, as you can see on that arrow, of what is sort of too low, just right, or too high. In the same way that a very low blood sugar or a very high blood sugar might be dangerous, the same is true with ketones. They are not innately harmful and actually have a number of kind of positive anti-inflammatory benefits, which is part of why we make them. They're also signaling molecules. And so what we want to think about is that in patients who have even a small amount of steady insulin production, they're actually not at risk for ketoacidosis. And that's because insulin acts as a sort of feedback loop, keeping ketones and thus pH in kind of a healthy range. Obviously, in patients who lack insulin, so someone with type 1 diabetes or a type 2 diabetic farther along that spectrum whose pancreas may no longer be producing enough, may be at risk for ketoacidosis. So they would be what we consider high risk, whereas most people would be lower risk. But of course, we're going to want to monitor. And this is part of why it's so important to not be prescribing an intervention like this unless you know your patient, you know their lifestyle, you know their medications, and you know their capacity to kind of monitor and adjust on their own. Click through here. Okay. And let's talk about what carbohydrate restriction actually looks like, because I think this is one, particularly as a dietitian, that I felt very reticent about because internet keto kind of skews it so much. And I hope what you see is that on this page, carbohydrate restriction looks like a balanced whole food plate, just a little bit different than perhaps the usual. It should be real whole foods, and it should not have a lot of processed foods or fine fats, no plant foods, things like that. The goal is that it doesn't matter kind of what preference the client has, but that they're filling it with proteins, healthy fats, vegetables, and maybe nuts, seeds, maybe even fruit or starchy vegetables, depending on what kind of spectrum of carbohydrate restriction they're on. We have borrowed these from a number of lovely people who kind of use carbohydrate restriction on the internet, and you can find their references there. But what I really want to point out is that for those of you who are health professionals, it is important we give patients the guidance that they still need plant foods and they still need fiber and they need those other nutrients as well. It's not always just about what we take out. Click through here. And so I will note on what about fiber on a carbohydrate restricted diet? And I think as a dietitian, this is especially important to me. And I feel I receive a lot of fear from kind of other health professionals about patients not getting enough. And I think that is largely, if patients are not getting guidance, of course, they're not going to get enough fiber. But all of my clients on carbohydrate restriction don't actually struggle with this at all, in part because I'm a big fan of a balanced plate. So if they've got a big old half plate or more of non-starchy vegetables, your peppers, tomatoes, your greens, your broccoli, your cauliflower, seeds and whole food fats like avocados, also high fiber, dark leafy greens, especially the roughage kind of heartier ones. And of course, if they need extra, using a booster like chia, ground flaxseed, or psyllium husk, or if needed, even something like Metamucil. So generally, if clients are eating a number of well-balanced kind of plant-forward meals a day where we're adding their fat and protein on top, they should actually get enough fiber if they've received really good guidance. And this is where that team again, and I know we harp on this a little bit, is so important to make sure patients are getting that support from a dietitian if they're struggling, that we're following up on their gut function, whether there's constipation or loose bowel movements, making sure we're still treating them as a whole patient and not just someone on a carbohydrate restricted diet. And I'm going to pass over to Eliana to talk about what's an important topic for the healthcare professionals especially, but what happens with blood work and how to interpret it.
Awesome, thanks, Michelle. So this review article by Feynman et al. In 2015 showed a review of 4 different dietary approaches. And the first thing that I see is 4 different approaches that a patient could try and get some various results, right? So patients should be picking what's best for them. But in terms of a carbohydrate restricted diet, what do we generally see? We do see some weight loss, although we do know that in the literature, sustainable weight loss is based on the most sustainable diet for that patient. Regardless though of weight loss, we see benefits in metabolic health. So improvements in your blood sugars, both fasting blood sugars as well as A1Cs. We see generally lower total cholesterol, beautiful reduction in triglycerides, and the literature shows increase in HDL, although I'll be honest, that one I don't see a ton of in clinic. But the one elephant in the room we need to talk about is the potential for LDL to go up. And in the literature, it shows that it might either not do anything or go up. I've seen it do everything. I've seen it go up significantly. I've seen it do nothing. I've seen it come down beautifully. With Michelle and I being moderate in this area, and of course being a dietitian where we don't want restriction in what people eat, we recommend starting off with allowing patients to eat saturated fat and eat as much of it as they want within, until they're full, and listening to their bodies. And if their LDL goes up, and of course we're working with a team and we're monitoring blood cholesterol levels and everything. If their LDL goes up, then we adjust our dietary approach. Do we take them off ketogenic diet? Not necessarily. Do we take away their fat? No. We switch it from saturated fat to monounsaturated fat, similar to a Mediterranean type diet. Increase their fish, increase avocados, olive oil, nuts and seeds, and that sort of thing. And that's where we're going to see the LDL come down beautifully. In terms of non-scale benefits, we're going to see increased satiety and reduced appetite. Why? Because patients are eating usually more protein and also more fat, which are both more satiating than carbohydrates. when we're not eating large amounts of processed foods and sugars, and maybe the carbohydrates as well, you don't have the big spikes in blood sugar. So you're going to have stable energy. And with intuitive eating, I will say that's probably for all whole foods. When you take away the processed foods, when you take away that sugar, your body can talk to you and tell you if it likes a food or if it doesn't like a food. We do see improved gut health with IBS side effects, heartburn. Now, I've seen it work beautifully and almost like cure patients. I use that word very loosely. I've also seen it where it helps a little bit or it does nothing. So every patient is different in terms of what benefits they see. And we've already kind of talked about the improvement in their metabolic blood work, as well as the reduction of medications, which is really, really exciting. Now, we don't want to put a patient on something that's going to have terrible side effects. So we have to understand the biochemistry to understand what's going on. So think natriuresis, right? So we're starting a carbohydrate restricted diet. You're cutting out the carbohydrates, probably first sugars, processed foods anyway, but then also maybe the portions of carbs. Insulin levels go down, right? Because you're not digesting that load. And insulin regulates the kidneys to absorb less or reabsorb or not reabsorb sodium. So you don't reabsorb sodium. At the same time, when we're not eating glucose, sodium does not get reabsorbed from the sodium glucose co-transporter 2. So from those two areas, you're not getting sodium, and then you pee it out. Water follows sodium due to osmolality. You end up with water weight loss. Patients are happy to think the diet's working. But what happens when you don't have enough sodium? Well, you're going to stress your body. And so then you're going to have the adrenals release aldosterone. So then you're holding on to sodium because you don't have enough, but now you're going to get rid of other electrolytes. So potassium or magnesium, that's not going to be fun. And then your adrenals are going to release cortisol. You might have sleep disturbance. So when we think about the side effects that could come with a low carb, and probably more specifically with a ketogenic diet, you're going to have increased urination because you are getting rid of more sodium. You might have what's called keto flu. So the headaches, the fatigue, the weakness, dizziness, lightheadedness. That makes sense because if you're dehydrated, you're having lower blood volume, which leads to orthostatic hypotension. You might get muscle aches, cramps, heart palpitations because of the different electrolytes. Fatigue, if you're dehydrated, you could have constipation either from low magnesium or not enough water. Anxiety, insomnia, if you're having that cortisol, possibly even from potassium. Some people get what's called keto breath, and that's when ketones come out as acetone in the breath. It's a fruity smell, and I find with patients who are prone to keto breath, they get it much worse if they are dehydrated. I've had a number of patients for whom it goes away when they're properly hydrated, but I've had one or two where regardless, it doesn't go away. Diarrhea can happen on metformin, so you can have a reaction to other medications on a low-carb or ketogenic diet, or too much too soon from coconut oil, MCT oil, inulin, chicory root from low-carb bars, and sugar alcohols can be notorious for your GI upset. The other thing that's really important to note is diuretic effect of alcohol. So for example, if someone's starting a low carbohydrate diet and they might on a weekend, finish a 6-pack, they could have a really bad couple of days, really bad hangover because of the diuretic effect. So we specifically contraindications for a ketogenic diet. If you're asking someone to go on a diet where fat is their primary fuel, if they have fat malabsorption, it's a bad idea, right? Contraindication. The other note that Michelle and I are pretty strong about is if there is a patient who has an eating disorder, any form of restriction is contraindicated. And so that's a really important thing to note. If you have questions, let us know. Potential contraindications are actually individual patient based. So you have to assess that individual. You'll see diabetes on this list. We're talking about diabetes. We're talking about how great this way could be for a patient. But if there's a patient that doesn't have a supportive team or doesn't have a knowledgeable team to help them come off of medication safely while they're doing this dietary approach, then it's contraindicated, right? So if you have questions about that, let us know as well. And I mentioned earlier, we have to be flexible. So we're talking about how to take patients down, but what happens if they're on a ketogenic diet and they need to come up? The big key is increasing carbohydrates slowly. If you go from 0 to 100, you're going to hurt. Because your body's not used to that carbohydrate load. You're going to have a huge fluid shift. It's going to alter your sodium levels, and you're going to have gastrointestinal issues because of the carbohydrate concentration. So there could be diarrhea, there could be cramping, constipation, IBS side effects, and your craving and hunger hormones can come crashing back. So if we increase carbs slowly, and generally the rule of thumb is about 30 grams of carbs every half week to a week, slowly to where those patients want to go, then you're going to have the least amount of side effects reintroducing carbohydrates. All right, I'm going to let Michelle talk about medication safety.
Thank you, Eliana. So I think this is such an important topic. And again, we do dive into it a little. Oh, we're getting some scroll back there. We do dive into it in more detail in kind of that other big presentation. I'm just going to see if I can get back to my slide. But I thought there was a few that we would highlight today for the practitioners who are here, or perhaps the patients who might be considering it. Obviously, there's a huge list of therapeutic considerations where if patients are on any of these or have any of these issues, you are going to want to make sure you assess them carefully for capacity to manage those side effects, to adjust their medications as indicated, whether or not it's actually a good fit, I think is one of our biggest kind of take homes today. But let's dive into a few of these specifics. There's a wonderful paper here that I would absolutely refer to if you are a practitioner who is working with patients on a lower carbohydrate diet. I'll let you dive into that for the details, but the ones I wanted to highlight are the ones that come with a risk of more serious side effects. And that is, of course, the ones that come with a risk of low blood glucose, where we might see, fainting, loss of consciousness, those kind of things, or things that lower blood pressure, because again, there is a real risk to doing that too quickly. These sulfonylureas obviously come with a risk of low blood glucose, so they are going to need to be adjusted as the patient reduces carbohydrate. So team effort is really important here, and patients realizing that their medications do have side effects so that they are aware before they dive in. Insulin, of course, is another one that needs to be adjusted fairly quickly. And so this is not a diet you'd use with someone who wasn't capable of being able to, one, connect with a healthcare practitioner, and two, kind of manage and adjust their insulin fairly safely as their meals change, because their own kind of insulin needs will go down as the blood sugar and carbohydrate intake goes down. The other that would be there would be the SGLT2 inhibitors. So not so much a risk of lows, but because they act by increasing your renal or your kidney glucose excretion, they can actually mask the high blood sugar that would normally be a kind of warning sign that we have diabetic ketoacidosis. And so for these patients, we're going to want to do blood work more frequently, measure things like anion gap to ensure pH is okay. Really just being a bit more cautious with patients on some of these heavy hitting medications. And of course, that last one is any of your blood pressure medications that act with a diuretic effect. Because blood pressure will go down so quickly, and we do see those fluid losses, as Eliana spoke about, we'll want to kind of decrease these rather in concert with the patient's change in diet so that they can safely feel good without risk of being fluid depleted, dizziness, fainting, things like that. I think the real take home here is, of course, the importance of the interdisciplinary team there.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, and let me just go back here. So quick takeaways before we hand it over to Raman. So thank you everyone for listening to us. The last takeaway is diabetes remission is possible. This was such a game changer for me even 2 and 3 years ago. I didn't have a clue that this was possible. But we have to understand that with some of these more intense dietary approaches, there are medication safety implications. And with that, you need interdisciplinary collaboration. Whole foods are always that starting point with patients, right? And they're tools in the toolbox. And at the end of the day, we can then offer our patients all the different tools in the toolbox and let them pick the best approach for them. So we have all of these references are going to be available for you. This is our contact information that will also be available to you. And our last poll that I'm going to let you guys answer while we answer questions for you is, moving forward, what would be most helpful? And let us know. You can pick more than one, and let us know so that we can help support you as you support your patients and help everybody get healthier.
Awesome.
There you are.
Awesome. So the poll is just going to be up during the Q&A, and we have lots of questions for you guys. So I'm going to actually take over.
Perfect.
And there we go. All right. So I guess just getting started first off, the first question we had come in is hoping to hear your experience of how much time or how many appointments are required to provide education and follow someone safely, as well as sustainability in public health versus private practice.
Whew, that's a big one. I find I generally get 5 appointments with my patients, and I would say that on average, depending on how low carb they go, if they're going full on ketogenic, I'm meeting with them in 2 weeks to discuss potential side effects, making sure they're not getting dehydrated, and making sure they're not thinking I have to be strong and just kind of like pull through, because you don't. You just have to eat more salt and drink more water. So I'm checking them at 2 weeks, and then again at 4 weeks. And then after that, depending, then I'm checking them monthly. So I would say, 3 to 4 follow-ups at least is probably important for a ketogenic diet, and probably a little less for lower carb, because it is more of a plate approach where you can still have half a cup of carbohydrates, maybe at lunch and dinner, and you're still going to be okay. Your thoughts, Michelle?
I would agree. So I think obviously population health, public health are always more challenging for more significant interventions. And I think it's the same as if a patient was on dialysis and they need like a low potassium controlled diet. They go to a clinic where we have that capability. And of course, diabetes clinics are already struggling with that. So we recognize that. I would agree that for most of my patients, I'm also in private practice at this point, but I've done outpatient, I've done everything for just kind of lower carbohydrate without lots of complications. So with a more sort of simple medication regimen, probably about 3 sessions is more than enough, but always making sure their physician's on board, that they have a pharmacist they trust. With ketogenic, I would agree, you're probably looking at 5 to 6, and that's a point of education with the patient of whether they have that team available, whether they're ready to commit to that kind of change. And a lot of patients are more interested in something more moderate when they realize how much goes into it, all the blood work, things like that. Good question.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. So this one's a good one too. So we have a question here saying, why are we still helping with restrictive weight loss diets when we know diets don't work? Most common outcome is usually weight gain, not sustainable eating pattern, not to mention all the negative unintended outcomes with dieting. Isn't this unethical considering all the evidence of the harm of diet? And I know you guys kind of touched on this a little bit throughout. So yeah.
I'm happy to field this one first because I actually do this work with my patients as well. So I think there's a couple important things here. And as dietitians, we're very aware of the negative impact of sort of chronic dieting and restriction that can have on our patients. But comparing a diet for diabetes remission to a generic weight loss diet like Jenny Craig or something would be similar to saying that patients with IBS shouldn't do low FODMAP despite the evidence, that someone on dialysis shouldn't go on a potassium restricted diet. I think what we're trying to say here, and I think what gets lost with all of the noise on the internet, is that yes, weight loss may be one outcome and there may be improved side effects with that, but we've got this whole host of evidence showing that patients maybe don't have to get amputations or have all of the macrovascular and microvascular complications at 60 or 70 or 80 if they choose. And I think one of the things Eliana and I really support is supporting clinicians to better screen for patients who it's not a good fit, for making sure that we are supporting them and weight not being the primary indicator, and also ensuring that we are giving them that sort of tools in the toolbox, because these are patients with a medical condition. Neither of us kind of utilize this approach. It's just like, hey, everyone should lose weight and do this. But it's a therapeutic intervention for a condition that for many people, they're super motivated to see improvement in, because they want that quality of care. So I fully understand that fear. And I see a lot of patients who've had damage from, not uncaring, but perhaps not great bedside manner or chronic dieting. And so I hear that fear and I really understand it, but it's not our job to say, you can't have this intervention because it doesn't feel right to me. We have to kind of talk that through and allow them to choose. Eliana, do you have anything to add to that?
I didn't, it's gone now.
But it's a good question. And I think it's an important.
I think actually, no, it's coming back. Actually, one of the things, and it's a fantastic question, because absolutely weight loss, while we understand in the literature that weight loss possibly is the trigger that is causing diabetes remission, weight loss from that mental perspective and how we've been fixated on it in the last 40 years is also unhealthy. And so we have to find a way to help patients in a metabolic way, perhaps removing ourselves from that weight piece, because in the literature, we also see that what's the best approach for weight loss? Well, it isn't a ketogenic diet. It also isn't any other diet. It's the most sustainable diet for the patient, right? And Michelle hit it really well in that if we can help a patient metabolically, we can make a huge difference. When I have a patient come to me, so full disclosure, my patients have metabolic dysregulation, right? That's who I see. I see patients who have prediabetes, high cholesterol, higher blood pressure. They're at risk for diabetes. I also see a lot of patients in the military. If they get diabetes, they get kicked out. So I'm not even looking at weight loss. We're looking at fixing their metabolic health so that they don't get diabetes, so that they don't end up on these medications, so that they don't end up losing their jobs. Now let's just talk medications. That's another reason patients come into my office is they're like, you ask them, well, why now? Why are you coming to see me? What is it that I can help you with? My doctor told me I'm about to go on medications. That is a huge fear for patients. And so if we can help them improve their health so they don't need medications, so they don't have to pay for these medications. I mean, in Canada, we're very lucky, but still, it's a big fear. There are side effects. And if we can help patients by adjusting their approach to whole foods first. And again, whole foods first, right? You talked about no diets. Okay, let's do whole foods first. But what if a patient cannot metabolically handle higher carbohydrates? Well, let's adjust that and find a better way for them. And what happens if we just increase their protein? They'll probably eat a little bit less food. Or less carbs. So we haven't taken away the carbs, we've just increased the protein. So there's different ways of looking at it. And yes, we try not to focus on the dietary piece, but I think we also throw out this concept that we can help people metabolically not need medications.
I love that.
So
I hope
good.
that helps.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to chat about that because I know that there's a lot of sometimes friction there. So I am happy to connect with people after as well.
Absolutely. Send us emails, let us know.
And Eliana and Michelle have graciously agreed to answer some of the questions offline. So we'll email out as well as post on our website answers to the questions because there's so many more great questions, so many. So we will do that afterwards. I apologize that we're not going to get to all of them, but we do want to just close up our last poll. So these are the results. So it looks like there's a great spread, but on this journey going forward in terms of what are the tangible next steps, it looks like patient guidelines as well as patient handouts are really what folks need. So thank you so much for that. I do want to start wrapping us up because I know everybody is busy these days. So I'm saving the questions. We will communicate those out via website and email. And a thank you, a huge thank you is in order. First to Eliana and Michelle, thank you both so much for yeah, the knowledge, the practical wisdom, all the experiences, that it takes so much. So thank you. And thank you to everyone for carving out the time and for your attention. As you know, this is our second in a series of webinars leading up to the Type 2 Diabetes Dialogue session, which will be hosted in November. So please take a second to, a couple minutes, it's not a second, but to provide feedback in our evaluation survey that Shauna will post in the chat, as well as email out after the session. And then with that, just a reminder that October 20th is our third and last webinar leading up to the dialogue session. So feel free to register. We'll be talking about some innovation from the divisions of family practice here in BC. And our last reminder is for the dialogue session in November. So we're about a month and a half out, and we're really looking forward to conversations similar to this one and really continuing the dialogue. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we're a minute early and we will be in touch. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a wonderful day, guys.
You too.